on as our main speaker. Yes, adjust a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, can you see me clearly?
Well, I can see you very clearly.
All right, let me just see if I can manipulate your picture here. All right, now it's fine. It's on speaker view. Okay. Good evening to the other participants. I see the president of AZAPO, Comrade Strike Tukwani, has joined. I see Mepuleng Motwa, who has been here for the last 20 or 30 minutes. Welcome. And I also see Ndate Cyril Morolo, who has expressed particular interest in the subject that we will be discussing for this evening. Let me, on this note, express a particular word of a welcome and a word of gratitude as well to our presenter for the evening, Dr. Khathutshelo Sikhitha. Dr. Khathutshelo Sikhitha, as you might have seen on the digital poster, is a practicing economist. He is also an academic, so he is seized with this matter on a day-to-day basis. Thank you very much, Dr. Sikhitha, for honoring us here with your presence. I also wish to express, I'm not sure if it's an apology or whether he will join us later. On behalf of Mr. Sibusiso Nyati, we had asked him also to be part of this panel as an economic analyst to help us to unpack this very heady subject of Black economic history. He is based out in the Eastern Cape, and we have been in communication throughout the afternoon, and he was forewarning me that he might not be able to make today's session because apparently there is a strike going on in their area, and he's not been able to recharge his laptop, and therefore he doesn't think that he would be in a position to join us. But if he does, if the power does return and he's able to charge his laptop, he will kindly also join this discussion and make his contribution. So we will wait on him. So I just thought we should start with that apology so that the participants aren't surprised as to why it's only Dr. Sikhitha this evening and he is not in the company of Mr. Sibusiso Nyati. But we are planning to have many of such forums, and we hope that at some point Mr. Sibusiso Nyati will be able to make his way through and to join us in one of the presentation where we'll be discussing an issue on political economy. Okay, now that we have dealt with the pleasantries, but before I invite Dr. Sikhitha to lead us into this discussion, I just felt that I should recount a bit on his bio. Dr. Sikhitha is a graduate, I think, of the University of Venda, and he has taught there for a long time. But he also furthered his studies in the United States on a very specialized area of economics, which is resource economics. He's an ex-colleague of mine. He has also worked in the public sector and in local government. So he's a man who brings a very rounded experience in this field of economics. He's a regular commentator on some of our radio stations, if I'm not mistaken in particular Palafala, but other stations, and many other people consult him on issues of political economy, economics, and the whole gamut of the subject that we will be dealing with this evening. So, in planning this Black History Month, where we are, doing a retrospective on ourselves as Black people as to where we come from. As we know, when you have been an oppressed people and when you are an oppressed people, a lot of your culture, a lot of your history, and almost everything about you gets either destroyed, hidden, obliterated, and in the process, we suffer a very damaged image about ourselves. And in the ke kopa hore re fane chance comrade re setse re simolotse ra go amogela. So in this area of economics, the reason why we thought we should do this retrospective, it's because for many of us who listen to economic commentators and who have been to university, in most instances, the references, the citations, and the paradigm is mostly Western centric. That is, you make references to America and Europe. And when you get out of there, you ask yourself, as an African, as a Black person, and by Black here, we use the political designation of Black, whether you are Indian or whether you are, for want of a better word, a colored person, you ask yourself, but why are my academic sources, why are my reference sources all originating from Europe? Why don't I read about Black economists? So we've asked Dr. Sikhitha to unpack this for us this evening. So Dr. Sikhitha, on that note, let me give you the platform to lead us into your discussions, into the discussions, and share with us what you have prepared for the audience this evening. This meeting is being flighted on YouTube and I think on Facebook at the same time. So please just make sure that it goes smoothly because there are probably other hundreds of people following this discussion outside. Welcome. Let's kick off. Over to you, Dr. Sikhitha.
Thank you very much, Mohamedi. And I think it will probably be in order for me to declare some kind of a disclaimer. So when you sent out the various topics we were going to be pleased with, I looked at them, and in terms of the time and everything, I thought I was going to focus on the last one that you had over there, which is what role Black people should play in shaping economic theory and practice.
Yes.
And in the 15 minutes that one was going to have available, I just thought, look,
you may use up Mr. Nyati's other 15 minutes, so I'll give you 30.
Yeah, no, but yeah, anyway, yeah, so I guess it will probably be a very narrow in scope, in the sense that that was the area that I thought I needed to focus on, given how involved and how perhaps important. And of course, one also has to acknowledge one may not necessarily have been in a position to be able to tackle everything. Yeah. Perhaps the first thing I wanted to find out is you probably might need to assist me in how to upload this presentation that I have. Otherwise, I can just work through it and I mean, just talk through. I think you'll probably be able to see me, but if it is able to, or if it is possible to post it, I think one would be happy if one is in a position to do that. How do I?
Well, you needed, if there is a green icon there in front of your computer that says share screen.
Yes, I see it.
Yeah, but then you need to upload whatever, I mean, wherever file you are drawing that from and share it. But if we can't do that now, I think maybe just speak through your presentation. We will be able to follow.
Okay.
And then after that, those who would want to have a copy of your presentation can then just leave their email addresses at the bottom of our chats, and then I will take the effort of sending it to them.
Yeah, okay. Well, I see the icon, but it says the host is disabled participant screen sharing. So I don't know if along the way that could be facilitated, then I can upload it. But right now I can't because I think the host is controlling that part of uh,
Yes.
the business. But okay, I do have yeah, I do have yeah, I do have the presentation here. But along the way, if it will be possible for that to be uploaded, then the participants will follow whatever it is that one is talking about. So, as I've indicated, out of all the various topics that Mohammedi had sort of indicated, maybe we want to talk about this, maybe we want to consider this. I thought, let me um, talk about the last topic that you indicated out of the range of topics that were there.
Mhm.
What role Black people should play in shaping economic theory and practice? And I was actually trying to bring that home for that to be perhaps
Uh, there are some participants who have not muted themselves. May I request, comrades and friends, that we mute ourselves? The platform is now for Dr. Sikhitha. So please just mind the sound in your background is disruptive. So just mute yourself and then we will go on smoothly if you do so. Thank you.
okay. Thank you very much. I think having indicated what I've indicated, so I'm basically going to confine most of what I'm going to talk about on what role Black people should play in shaping economic theory and practice. And I kind of like try to confine it to our circumstances because the idea was, I think the other panelists were going to give us a global picture and what have you. But maybe perhaps before I do that, I just wanted to indicate that, I mean, if you are talking about Black people in general, they have played, I think, a very important role in global economic discourse, global economic history, and indeed, they've probably contributed to just about what constitutes whatever we see or whatever we think
Mm,
the modern economies that we can talk about, whether you're talking about the USA, the UK, and so on and so on. I mean, I mean, if you look at the USA, it was literally built on a black labor, if you can put it like that.
mm,
Whether you are talking about slavery or whether you are talking about the transatlantic slave trade and you are talking about the slave economy in the South, even in the north of the US. I mean, you can extend the same to the UK and to other countries in Europe. So, and if you take it even further, I mean, Black people have contributed a lot, even though perhaps the tendency has been to gloss over a number of things that maybe they might have contributed, as far as even the shaping of economic history as we know it today
mm.
is concerned. And like I said, I thought maybe the other panelists were going to delve a little bit more on that. So I just thought maybe lightly one could just talk about this, maybe for a lack of a better word, in passing. But I think the one thing that I think we need to probably take note of is if you look at the way the reality for the average or for the typical Black person, let's say on the African continent.
Mm.
I think the way we have organized ourselves economically is a bit inimical to the way we teach economics or to the way mainstream economics is today.
Okay.
In our economics classes, we start off by telling our first year students in a typical economics class, I think almost everywhere on the African continent, that, you know, the primary economic agent is an individual. this individual is rational. And by rational, we mean this individual is selfish. I mean, the individual thinks about himself or herself first and foremost, and whatever decisions he or she undertakes from an economic point of view or from whatever point of view are informed by the fact that this person wants to participate in events or activities that primarily are centered on that particular individual. Now, I think on average, perhaps most of us are going to agree that that is not necessarily how a typical African society or a typical African setup has always been organized. So in a way, when we are looking at the typical, maybe neoclassical economic setup that unfortunately is the view that is very dominant, or the view that tends to be dominant by way of academic training or what have you, it is a bit inimical to the way perhaps a typical African economy has been organized. An African economy where it has always been more than the self. It was me and others, if one can put it like that. I mean, just to bring the point home, if you look at the Nigerian Civil War, at the end of the Nigerian Civil War, and the East, what then was called Biafra, ended up being part and parcel of the overall Nigerian setup. I mean, at the end of that war, probably more than 1 million people had perished, parents, grandparents, and so on and so on. But within probably 2 to 3 years, the social economic setup in the East, and indeed perhaps in most parts of the African continent, was such that you probably will not have known that there have been a civil war that has decimated about 1 million people, because relatives, distant or very close, were able to take home or to take into the fold those who perhaps would have been orphaned as a consequence of that war, those who have lost homes, and so on and so on. And indeed, when you read about that war, a lot of people will marvel at how within probably a period of about 5 years, you know, you had a safety or a social safety net which was such that, you know, people were looking after each other, taking each other, and you know, enabling or making it possible for people to cope with the aftermath of what otherwise would have been a very devastating setup. We don't teach that in economics. The
Okay.
economics that we teach is you are an individual, you are selfish, you are worried about maximizing your
You're,
own satisfaction given whatever constraints
you're not,
they are. We don't teach people about the value of a commune, which is basically how, on average, a typical African society has been set up or whatever. So I guess this is probably something that if we take into account our lived reality or experiences as Black people, perhaps in general, and Africans in particular, this is one thing that probably needs to be, in my opinion, looked at in a manner which will take into account whatever academic discourses we want to put onto the table, but the discourses of which must also take into account our lived realities, because in as much as we teach students in an economic class, and we are always talking about how much it is important for you to be an individual, for you to be selfish and what have you, probably to a very large extent, even if not the whole extent, our lived reality is very different from what we teach students in an everyday economics class. So I think probably one needed to take that into account. Maybe just to
okay.
give you an example, if you look at, I think it must have been 2019 or 2020, the economist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, I think it was Paul Romer. He's probably a famous macroeconomist in the US. And in fact, what he has done was, instead of the way that macroeconomics has always been traditionally looked at, you know, we look at the economy as the aggregate and what have you. He is famous for perhaps introducing what people call the microeconomic foundations of macroeconomics. So his focus of this, his point of departure is to look at individual behavior. So
Okay.
if an individual is going to look at things in this way, and then that individual is able to come up with an optimal outcome, if you, for a lack of a better word, then we can simply scale that up to other individuals who are like this selfish individual who's behaving rationally. And if
Who are motivated by greed. That's what I was taught
yes,
at university.
yes. So that's why I'm saying when we talk about economics as a discipline, the dominant economic trend that we have today, we teach it in South Africa, we teach it in just about every university in the so-called Western world and what have you. I think we are basically talking about something that is inimical. We tell this person, you need to be greedy.
Okay.
But when this person goes home, they are confronted by a reality which is very different from what we drum into their heads and what have you and what have you. So I think the point that I wanted to draw up here is indeed, if we are talking about the role that economics has played in people's lives and the role that blacks may have played in the economics discipline, perhaps we should not lose sight of the fact that mainstream economics, and indeed I think it extends over to the way the global economic setup is today. If you want to go against the grain, chances are you are probably going to find it very difficult to bring about an idea that works, but goes against conventional wisdom. I mean, maybe to give you another example, not so long ago, the government of the US decided it had issues with the government of Iran. And as a result, they slapped sanctions on the government of Iran. So they extended it further, and the idea was nobody should do business with Iran. Guess what? Most of the oil that South Africa imported was coming from Iran. South Africa did not have an issue with Iran, and South Africa has been importing oil from Iran from since whenever, if one can put it like that. And indeed, there was a time when even this Reza Pahlavi, the so-called Shah of Iran, even spent time in South Africa, I think in the 40s, before he became the Shah. But the Americans ended up insisting that because they have a problem with Iran, everybody else should have a problem with Iran, including the fact that South Africa should not import oil from Iran. The South African refineries were geared for whatever oil was coming from Iran. So things had to be re-engineered and so on and so on. So I'm trying to indicate that unfortunately, the economics of greed, which unfortunately happens to be perhaps the dominant economic theory or the economic idea doing the rounds today, is such that it does not necessarily talk to how much on average perhaps a typical African society and lived reality would have
Okay.
been. So you have that bit of a disjuncture. So that is
If
what.
I may come in there, Doctor, thanks for laying the ground theoretically for us. You've touched on the generalized economic being and how it is assumed they behave or their behavior is. So what you are saying is the dominant economic paradigm then operates along that rationale. Now, if I listen to you well, you are saying, no, but that rationale is out of step with the way we view economics as Africans, because we view it from a communal sense. And I like the example that you made that, cultural networks are very important, because without cultural networks, that so-called rational economic being will be without economic safety nets if we were to go full stream into it. And that example that you gave about Biafra's recovery. Now, where I want you to go into is whether these dominant economic theories, has there been any contestation about or around them coming from the black world, you know? And who are those personalities? What theories, what ideas have they advanced which are in contradistinction to what Paul Ronna, if I got his name correctly, but generally
Paul
this,
Roma,
yeah, yeah, yes.
I guess, yeah, thank you very much for that intervention. I guess, yeah, you could say there have indeed been attempts to present an alternative to maybe what we may call the dominant view regarding how things are supposed to be like. So if, for example, even though I may just mention, maybe without necessarily going that much into extensively into it, I mean, if you you look at the views that probably were propagated by people like Fanon, Walter Rodney, just to mention a few, you could very much agree with me that they had kind of like proposed a view that was very different from the current conventional view. But I think what I'm trying to indicate is today, when you look at the way the economic setup or the economic situation is set up, even if one is proposing something that will go a very long way in addressing or even talking to the lived reality on the ground, it is either not in the mainstream, or even if it is not in the mainstream, you are probably going to find a situation where it is frowned upon. You are either a radical who should not be listened to because you are saying things that goes against the grain. And indeed, if you are probably going to have a state which is going to say, you know what, the idea or the economic model of an individual being greedy and not being communal is not how we want to do things. The example about the oil that South Africa was importing from Iran, and then because the USA had an issue with Iran, also went on to the extent that, you know what, South Africa should not import Iranian oil. Not because there was any beef or any problem between South Africa and Iran, but because there was primarily an issue between the US and Iran. And indeed, the US was now adopting a position that everybody should have a problem with Iran, maybe except for countries that are big like China, that can very easily be in a position to dictate how they want to chart their way forward. In South Africa, we actually ended up deciding we are not going to buy Iranian oil anymore. Not because there was a problem with the Iranian oil. Indeed, South African refineries were geared to process or to refine Iranian oil and not any other oil, which meant it was at a huge cost for South Africa to re-engineer things to accept oil from wherever, if one could put it like that. So I think what I was just trying to say was, even if there is a counter view to what is necessarily viewed as being the general way things are supposed to be looked at, unfortunately, the way the economy or the global economy is set up and the forces that you have on the ground are such that even if there is an alternative view, in my opinion, which could very easily go a very long way in addressing and perhaps even taking things forward in a manner that is a beneficial, productive, or otherwise. You know, there are a lot of forces which not only frowns down upon that alternative point of view, but will probably even go to the extent of ensuring that that counter view probably does not even take hold, if
Okay.
one could put it like that.
Okay.
But
If
I
I,
think
yeah.
above all, I wanted to say, I wanted to say that more, maybe as an introduction, or maybe over and above, I think what I've prepared, and I'm connected to, I think, WhatsApp. I can actually send you this presentation, and then because you are controlling the screen share, then you can also put it up so that I don't have to talk to it without maybe other people being able to follow it. I think
All
over
right.
and above, maybe what you were going to suggest, I think I can go ahead, send it to you, and then you can project it from your side so that I don't have to just read. There are some graphics, there are some tables, and so on and so on.
Okay. Okay. Attempt to do that. I'll see what's possible from my side. But as you are doing that, let me also try and make a general point about economic history,
Okay.
and build on the area that you had chosen to address us on economic theory. Now, when you look at the history of economic theory, there are specific names that, even if you just read as a political economist, or if you are reading pure economics at university, there are specific names that will always be mentioned. Your Milton Friedmans, your John Maynard Keynes, your Adam Smiths, and to a point also Karl Marx, just to contrast that there is contestation around the area of economics. Now, how does this relate or talk to me as an African person? Where must I locate myself? Because then I say, but Milton Friedman is a white guy. John Maynard Keynes is a British fellow. Karl Marx is of German and Jewish and British descent or nationality. And then Adam Smith is American, I mean, and this has been the case for probably almost 200 years, if not for more than a century. Now, we continue to channel our kids, to schools that teach that kind of theory. Now, I know you mentioned Walter Rodney, and we will come to Walter Rodney and the important place that he occupies as an economic historian. But as an economist yourself, are there blacks, Africans that you could highlight, that you have, whose writings you may have come across to say, I mean, like you've correctly laid the point that there are black people who have, theorized on economics, but, we never get to see their works because the system is designed such that it suppresses certain knowledge and information, and then it venerates other knowledge and information. So I just want you to recount, if you have a few of those economists or economic historians, or just philosophers who wrote on political economy, who are black. I know a few, but I don't want to lead you into this discourse. I want you to lead us, and then we could probably open the discussion later, and then maybe there are other participants who are keen, who could also share what they know about us, because this is a public education adult learning environment. So when we put you there in the pedestal, we are not assuming or suggesting that you have exhausted all the knowledge around the subject, because by definition it is a very wide area to explore. But maybe if you can just share your ideas on that.
Oh, okay, thank you. First, let me just indicate I've sent you the presentation that I've actually put it together. So if you open your WhatsApp, you'll get it, and then you can project it and what have you. Yes, yeah, indeed. I mean, there are some, without necessarily having to entirely exhaust the scope. Perhaps one could probably just highlight a few of those who have probably made an impact, unfortunately, on the dominant economic discourse that we have today. Well, I just also wanted to point something out. Adam Smith, you pegged him as an American.
Oh, yes.
A lot of people consider him as the father of modern economics, and he's a British, but that's probably neither here nor there.
Okay.
But if you are looking at let's say, black people who have probably also contributed to the way we look at, unfortunately, modern day economics, I will probably peg those that indeed probably have gone on to recognized. I mean, over and above people like Mkandawire, maybe Rodney, and Fanon, and even people like Amilcar Cabral. If you listen to their
Yeah,
writings and
yeah.
their writings, Julius Nyerere, for example. But if you are looking, let's say, from a mainstream economics, as a discipline, take somebody like Arthur Lewis,
Okay.
who's probably at this point, probably somebody you may call maybe the only black
Perhaps,
person
perhaps
as an
explain who Arthur Lewis is for the audience so that they can
yeah.
follow. Yeah.
No, I was coming to
All
that.
right.
Yeah, I
Thank
mean,
you.
if you look at Arthur Lewis, he's perhaps what you may call a black person in our nomenclature in South Africa. Perhaps you call him a black person, and an African person in particular, if you put it like that. I'm from
Okay.
St. Lucia, and I think to this day, Arthur Lewis is the only black person, as perhaps an African person who has been awarded a Nobel Prize in Economics. I think he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1979. And he was actually recognized for what is now one of the branches in economics that we call development economics.
Okay.
But if you look at the work that Arthur Lewis was focused on, that gave rise to development economics, even though other people have added other, ideas and what have you, it was still rooted on this dominant economic system that we have. So basically, Arthur Lewis's work, the one that got him recognized with a Nobel Prize, maybe you can call it the ultimate prize for a practicing economist, was this idea that when you have a country that is still developing, still poor by definition, it will have what you call surplus labor, perhaps engaged in agriculture.
Yeah.
And the idea, as most of these economic development models will posit, is the idea is for people to move away from this agricultural sector, which is underdeveloped, characterized by surplus labor, getting lower wages, and so on and so on. And the idea is for an economy characterized by surplus labor to transition into a capitalistic economy, capital intensive and what have you. But because this surplus labor is used to getting maybe relatively speaking lower wages than what you are going to get in the capitalistic economy, with that surplus labor, you are able to transition into maybe a modern capitalistic economy because the productivity in the agricultural economy, which is characterized by surplus labor,
Mm.
will maintain productivity and wages at a lower rate, in which case it will be easier. With a slight adjustment in the wages in the capitalistic sector, you'll be able to lure people away. So at the end of that model, is still this idea that the dominant way of doing things is a particular outcome, which perhaps is characteristic of what you call the neoclassical economics. Yes, there was a lot of people, or there were a lot of people who had issues with Arthur Lewis's model, but at the end of the day, it was tried out in a number of countries, and overall, in Egypt, it didn't work. In Taiwan, it didn't work. But in Singapore, what Arthur Lewis was proposing was found to work. But curiously enough, Arthur Lewis's ideas didn't work in his home country of St. Lucia. But be that
Okay.
as it may be, he was recognized with the award. And I think it takes a place of pride if you're talking about the conventional economics that we teach students in our economics classes. There was also another black economist, Amartya Sen, from India, even though he is now based in the US, who was working in, he also worked in development economics, basically refined the ideas that Arthur Lewis pushed ahead. And then he also worked in basically what constitute social choice, the kind of things that Kenneth Arrow was recognized for. He also did a lot of work on that, improved upon Arthur Lewis's work, tried to look at the challenges or the criticisms that people had on Arthur Lewis's work, and then improved on that. And I think Amartya Sen was recognized with a Nobel Prize, not Amartya Sen, he was recognized with a Nobel Prize, I think in 1998, if I'm not
Okay.
mistaken.
Okay.
And then you also have, I think in 2019, there was this couple, another black person, but also Indian, if you can put it like that. This Banerjee, I think
Okay.
called
Yeah.
Banerjee, him and his wife Esther Duflo or Daflo, they were also working primarily on development economics, and their work was primarily focused on how to address the issue of poverty, which was also rooted on, they were also improving upon what Arthur Lewis did, and then focus or interested in how to tackle the issues of poverty. And they were finally rewarded with a Nobel Prize in economics at a relatively young age. Esther Duflo was born in 1972. Banerjee was born in 1964. I mean, typically, a typical economist would be, mainstream economists would be recognized probably in their 70s, 60s. I mean, all along, Kenneth Arrow was considered the youngest economist to be ever awarded a Nobel Prize in economics at the age of about 56.
Okay.
If you look at this
All
couple
right.
and whatever. But I think the one thing that I want to still emphasize upon is we are talking about economists whose point of departure is that the individual is greedy and then develop their models on the basis of a greedy individual who then goes on to do all these kind of things that optimizes their behavior and so on and so on and so on, which in my opinion probably still does not talk to probably the lived reality
Okay.
of a lot of people in developing economics and even in poor
But
economics
is
and
it
whatever.
only in the developing world? Because this idea that the rational economic being is one who is individualistic, who is greedy, who does all of these things has been contested. Even Karl Marx himself, his theory on political economy goes against that mainstream. So, I mean, I do agree with you, but what I'm saying is, even from the places where these mainstream economies come from, up to this day, there continues to be people with alternative ideas, probably as bright, if not brighter, than the ones who have been awarded Nobel prizes in economics. But it's just that the powers that be don't like their ideas, and therefore they don't award them those prizes. So, but anyway, that's a discussion for another day. But I just thought maybe perhaps we should try and ground it. Now, let's talk about those black people who have, made significant contributions in economics or political economy, as we prefer to call it, but who might not necessarily have been awarded Nobel prizes. I mean, in your introduction, you spoke about Julius Nyerere, who was a trained economist himself, and he spoke about African socialism, Ujamaa, and all of those things. You spoke about the late Professor Thandika Mkandawiri, who died last year. I think there is also the Nigerian professor who is recognized for his contributions, particularly in shaping the AU's economic thinking. Uh, but I mean, would you share with us, even if they are not, your Nobel Prize economists, but we recognize them as leading economists? Would you share with us perhaps what their alternative or heterodox thinking on economics was, maybe just to, because the whole point here is to orientate ourselves to names of black economists which are not necessarily in accord with the mainstream, but all the same individuals who've made a major impact in the field of economics. And sorry if I'm putting you on the spot, because I don't want to create an impression that you know all of these answers. We will open up for participants later. There might be others, for instance, who know about the economic mind of Professor Guy Mohone, who made a telling contribution in the field of labor economics with his concept of absorption capacity and cavity. But let me not put you there. But maybe just share with us, what was Thandika Mkandawiri's economic mind? What was Julius Nyerere? And then, just to ground it, because we will then open it up and discuss it with the audience later.
Okay, but before that, may I please find out if you have received the presentation?
I have received it. Can you see it on the screen? I've tried to share it.
Yeah, because that's basically what.
Can you see it?
Yes, yeah, I can see it.
All right.
Because that is.
All right, maybe talk to it, but let's not make it too technical at the risk of us losing the people here, and then you'll tell me then to move the slides for you. Is that okay?
Yeah. No. Thank you very much for that, Mohammed. Overall, if you look at the overall ideas that Julius Nyerere was espousing, this whole idea of ujamaa, this idea of the group being much more important than the individual.
Yes.
Perhaps that's the one area or the one thing that one will probably push ahead. And I will say what Julius Nyerere was espousing is typical of how even this, individual that we start off by assuming should be greedy, you should be selfish or whatever. That is how human beings are social beings. And that is generally how society and human beings have always kind of like organized themselves. And I think what I was trying to say was, unfortunately, when you look at the economics discipline, what we teach students in classes, and what we would like to have as our lived reality, it is either shunned, it is either looked down upon, and indeed, in any case, if you want to perhaps pursue or persist in that, you are probably going to be a lone voice out there, a lone person out there, a lone country out there, with lots and lots, let's say, of sanctions imposed against you.
Yes.
The idea is this conventional or any idea that runs counter, in my opinion, to this selfish, greedy individual who forms the core of economic ideas. We start from that individual and we take it upwards. Anything that runs counter to that, even though that is actually how the average person organizes themselves around other people.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it hasn't really had a lot of traction, and indeed it is not supposed to even take root. I mean, that is perhaps, in my own humble opinion, that is what I've come to realize and what have you. So at least my idea, again, as a panelist, was apart from the various topics that you have kind of like indicated,
yes,
I was probably going to look at what you have on the screen from the point of view of saying, given this reality that we have around us, one is not being prescriptive. When you take into account where we are, if one can put it like that, and you look at our lived reality, because even when you look at the ideas that Adam Smith was propounding, whether it was the invisible hand or what have you, it was shaped by the lived reality of what Adam Smith was going through in England at that particular point in time. And it gave rise to this particular idea that apparently now is a common currency. But who's to say that is the only way of doing things? Clearly, a selfish, greedy individual is not necessarily representative of the lived reality of even people in England. or people in Africa or any other part of the world, if one can put it like that. But the conventional wisdom is you have to be greedy, maximize your own welfare and what have you. So I was saying, or I was thinking, if that is the conventional wisdom that we have over there, from our point of view, at least based on what you heard on the screen a few minutes ago, which is what I thought that was going to be the gist of my presentation.
Okay, is it
I'll
still there?
probably
Can you still see it?
yeah, I see it. So
Okay.
maybe what you can do is you can move to the next slide.
Okay, let me just see if I
Slide.
can. All right.
Yeah, just
I'm not
move down
waiting. Is
to
it
the next
is it
slide.
big enough for everybody? I'm trying.
Go to the slideshow tower up there.
Slideshow. Where is this now?
Yeah, it's
Where is
up.
it? Okay, slideshow.
Click
Okay,
there.
just hold on a second, TD. Yeah, thank you. Slideshow, yes. And then I go
Then go to
to
presentation.
presentation. Okay, it's presentation. I'm at the slideshow.
Yeah, click at that one on your left where it says from beginning, and then it will enlarge it.
Okay, just hold. I don't have that. What you're talking about? Let me see.
Extreme
Right
left.
there. That's the first one.
Extreme. Oh, this one from beginning. This one. There we go. There we go. Thank you very much. We all learning here. Eh?
All right.
Okay, thank you, Sidi.
Yeah, then you can go to the next slide.
All right, now that's the other danger because now let me see.
Yeah, just
There we go.
yeah.
There.
Now, okay, no, the one above.
The one above it.
Yeah, the one before this one that you have. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. No. Okay, just the next slide.
Next one.
Yeah.
Is this the one?
Yes. That's the one.
Okay.
That's the one.
Mhm.
Now, at least, well, from the point of view of one of the issues that you have raised, I mean, the idea was, after we have talked about the contribution of African economies and so on, then at least I had kind of like tailor-made, and my view was, let me have this small bite on, among other things, what is it that we need to do? If you look at the previous slide, that was one of the topics that you have kind of like suggested.
Yeah.
And my view was, when you look at present day South Africa, or perhaps a typical African country, the issue of inequality and the issue of poverty is uppermost in the mind. So when you look at that first bullet point, where it reads, poverty itself exerts a demoralizing influence. It often causes loss of self-respect and a feeling of inferiority. It easily has a detrimental effect on honesty, trustworthiness, and morality. If it is long continued, the poor white often comes to accept it as inevitable and to bear it with dull and passive resignation. And this attitude is further contributed by the feeling of inferiority that poor whites have. Now, when you look at this is something that came out of the Carnegie Commission report in 1932. And then my view was, if on the second bullet point, if you, and the second one is, at the root of the so-called poor white problem at that point was land dispossession. My view was, land dispossession is not unique to white people. In fact, to a very large extent, they had dispossessed others. And if all of us agree that land dispossession leads to poverty, inequality, and all sorts of things that even called for that commission, then perhaps we are starting somewhere. And then the third bullet point, I was actually saying, if you look at present day South Africa, just substitute the word white in that very first bullet point, and then you are going to be talking exactly about where a typical or the average Black South African, or indeed perhaps a Black person in all these other countries that at one time or another were colonies of other countries and what have you, and the root of poverty probably could be explained primarily, first and foremost, land dispossession and all its attendant consequences, if one can put it like that. And on the last bullet point over there, I wanted to say or to highlight the fact that the Carnegie Commission, the first one, 1927 to 1932, which was primarily aimed at addressing the question of poor whites. And indeed, even then, there was an acknowledgement that it's not only the question of poverty and being poor was not only confined to whites.
Yeah.
Even among blacks, it was even worse. But for now, we are going to start with this particular race, maybe because the sensibilities at that time could not accompany or stomach the idea that white people could be poor in terms of what was prevailing in that particular point. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that the Carnegie Commission looked at about 5 important areas: economic, psychological, educational, health, and sociological. Because indeed, a human being is more than just a particular issue, attribute that we can pick up. If you are talking about poverty, it has a lot of other attendant issues. And I guess maybe as one moves on, one is probably going to say, if at one point in the economic history of this country,
Yeah.
there was a concerted effort to look at a particular problem, poverty, but then it was engaged upon in a manner that was, for a lack of a better word, attempting to look at it holistically.
Okay.
If one is talking about what is it that needs to be done, either by black economists, practicing or otherwise, or even going forward, I don't think it is enough to always rehash the fact that, you know, poverty, we probably beat everyone in terms of inequality and what have you, without necessarily saying, then what? And the then what? So let us just go to the next slide quickly.
Okay, now it looks like my screen is not moving, or my thing is not moving. Oh, studio could choose more.
Just go to the next slide. I think, I don't know, maybe the down arrow could simply...
I'm trying to use the down arrow, but earlier on it was. Maybe I should try and reduce the screen.
That's not the case for everybody. So not only am I really grateful.
Okay.
All right, there we go. It's moving now, which is the next one.
Yeah,
if we can try and move a bit quicker through the slides, because I want us to use the third. Oh, come on.
That's what I want to do. Let's just go to the next slide.
Just hold on. Let me just check who's making noise here.
Okay. Let's just go to the next slide.
Wait. I need to either mute somebody. Comrades, can you please mute yourselves, because we are being disruptive now.
Let's just go to the next slide.
All right, let's go. There we go.
Okay. Yeah, this one. Now, very quickly, with this slide, one is simply saying, if you divide the economy into 10 equal groups, let's say from the lowest to the highest. This is the most recent data that we have in terms of this attribute. You look at 2006 and 2015.
Yeah.
The bottom line is, in this country, the top 10% spends more than all the other deciles. If one can put it. And indeed, the other interesting thing is, when you look at whether you are looking at 52.6% of total expenditure in 2015 or 57.2% expenditure in 2006, there is another interesting feature of it. Your so-called relatively
just so that we don't go quickly through this graph here, explain to the participants the comparison between 2006 and 2015. The other one is a bit lime and the other one is a bit blue. And what your slide is trying to communicate here.
Oh, yeah. Okay. No. Well, I was thinking in the interest of time. Basically, what this table is showing, it is showing how expenditure.
Okay.
I mean, expenditure is basically what drives your economy. You spend, you know, it stimulates production and what have you, because we spend. When we don't spend, the modern economy does not move at all, which is probably, you know, when you hear people celebrating that inflation is the lowest it has ever been. Why? Because on average, we are not spending. And as such, if we are not spending on aggregate as much as we ought to, then we are not going to put pressures on prices, and then we are not going to have inflation. It's not a good thing that we have inflation as low as it is, because it simply tells us we are not spending. Either we are not spending because most of us are unemployed, they don't have the means to spend, and whatever. So with this diagram or this chart, one wanted to simply indicate the current state of affairs. Basically, that's why on top I've indicated where things or some of the things stand at the moment.
Okay.
And I just thought, if we zero in on expenditures, aggregate expenditures, in an economy which is divided equally into 10 equal groups, the first decile, where you have 1 and 2 up to number 10, being from the lowest income to the highest income. Ideally, if you were to assume that wealth was distributed equally,
okay, all right.
you would have a situation where you didn't have one decile spending more or receiving more than the other. If wealth
more than 50% of the rest of the other deciles. Okay, all
So
right, no,
what
that's
you-
fine. I think let's move.
Yeah, the blue one is simply showing what was happening in 2006,
Yes.
and the yellow one is simply showing what was happening in 2015, which also happens to be the last time when this information was available.
Well,
So
there's a positive there, isn't there? I mean, at least the graph has declined a bit from 2006 to 2015. But anyway, let's not stay too much on there.
Yeah, no, you are right. But what this graph is showing us is the top 10% is still responsible for more than 50% of the expenditure.
Okay.
And what does this top 10% spend its money on?
All right.
It primarily spends its money on services, not on goods.
Oh, I
which
see.
in a way will explain why, among other things, manufacturing has been a declining sector, because the people who buy those manufactured goods don't have the money, don't have the means. Those who have the means are spending money on lawyers, psychologists, equipment. I mean, on basically what constitutes services in the economy. And
which is not the thing that drives an economy.
Yeah, and it stands to reason why the services economy sector, probably when you look at the economic data year in and year out, every time quarterly data comes out, you hardly see the services sector declining.
Yeah.
All these other sectors are going to decline, but basically, the people who have the money to drive the economy do not spend it on goods and services. They don't spend it on refrigerators, stoves, microwave ovens, the kinds of things, the bolted nuts that basically take economy from one point to another.
Okay.
This slide that you have over here is basically looking at average wealth in terms of these different groups. If you go back to that those deciles from the first one to the 10th one, and this data is based on quite a number of information. So when people have the opportunity to have access to these slides, because you have them, they will be able to look at primarily is household wealth composed of a number of factors: non-financial assets, financial assets, houses, and so on and so on and so on. Okay. What do you have over here? You have a situation where the top 10% has more assets than the bottom 90% within the South African economy. Okay. And indeed, if you look at the last entry over the top 0.01% of the top 10%, which is basically only 3.5 or 3,540 individuals. Yes. If you look at this data that it was based on 35.4 million people, okay, they actually account for 14.9% of the wealth, which is actually even higher than that of 3,540 South Africans account for more wealth than the bottom 90% of what we have in this country.
Okay, let's move to the next slide.
If you go back to the first slide where land dispossession was considered the root cause of what constituted the problem of other people being poor in this country, even though the focus was only on one group is. Now let us look at the whole issue around land ownership in this country. on average, 79% of the land is privately owned. Privately owned in the sense that it is registered, title deed and what have you. 14% is state-owned land. That is primarily where, among other things, you are going to find the bulk or the majority of your Africans. And the unaccounted extent is basically the amount of land that is not registered or what have you, but that is taken out of what the total land area of this country is in terms of hectares. So on average in South Africa, we have 121,000 million hectares, and it is broken up in terms of what you see over there.
Okay,
Let's
thanks.
go to the slide. And then when you go further, I mean, maybe without belaboring the point, the highest amount of land from that 79% we had in the previous slide,
Yes.
the highest amount of land is basically composed of farms and agricultural holdings.
Okay.
They account for about 97% of the land.
Yeah.
Now, if you go back a few years, in South Africa, you own land when you have a title deed.
The person who has just signed on, can you please mute yourself? All right, let's go on.
Okay, no, so when you look at this table, effectively 97% of the land in South Africa is composed of farms and agricultural holdings, for a lack of a better word, your plots. Out of this privately held land, because then because that is what constitutes the majority of the land ownership in this country. That is, if we are saying land dispossession accounts or explain primarily this question of poverty, inequality, or what have you. I just thought maybe let us delve on it. Then let's go to the next slide.
Okay, I think the point has been made here. This is provincial distribution and according to racial groupings. Okay.
Now, what you have over here is we are still talking about that 114 million hectares of privately owned land. It is primarily composed of farms and land holdings. So this basically just gives you an idea.
All right.
I thought I wanted us to look at either African, colored, Indian, or whatever constitutes black in this country. Just go back to the previous slide.
I want us to move. I think we have foregrounded the point about land dispossession or land inequity being at the root of economic inequality and so many other indicators in this country. Perhaps let's just see if there could be, maybe let's get your closing remarks. Yeah.
Okay, now what I think, let's say, don't forget my presentation was grounded on what is to be done.
Yes.
I think what I wanted to say was, if land dispossession is at the root cause of poverty and being poor. Yeah. And indeed, there was a time in the history of this country where there was a concerted effort to tackle poverty, being poor, in a very concerted way. Indeed, you're looking at all the dimensions, economic, psychological, and what have you, and what have you. Your question, what
Malusi, please, Malusi, can you please mute yourself? You are disrupting us here. Can you hear me, Malusi? Can you please mute your laptop, your sound? Malusi? All right, that's fine. Okay, go ahead, Dr. K. Dr. Sikhitha? Have we lost him? Have we lost the doctor? Okay, he's back now. Okay, go ahead, doctor.
He has muted himself then.
Oh, unmute. Dr. Sikhitha, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay. I've unmuted myself. I don't know how I muted myself.
Yeah, I think he does it automatically if somebody else is on the mic. Yeah, all right.
I'm very sorry about that. I think my concluding remarks regarding that presentation that we have gone through was going to be perhaps as an attempt, one of the things that maybe one might take into account vis-a-vis the question that you have raised, what is to be done or what to do as either Black economists or what have you, and the issue being one of poverty. My contribution here was going to be, if we look at the current reality of land, patterns of land ownership in this country, and we take into account that there was a time in the history of this country when the question of poverty was tackled. And indeed, when you look at what happened to that particular community where the focus was on, indeed within a generation, they were able to address the question of poverty. Using means that, of course, were exclusionary. I think my point was going to be, when all is said and done, maybe can we not have a situation where perhaps in the future, when we look at African economists, our economic theory and what have you, what if it could be directed to a certain extent to addressing comprehensively this issue of poverty, given everything that I think we have indicated or that we may have explored over and above everything else in this particular slide. That basically was going to be my contribution to this whole discussion, given at least the series of questions that you have indicated. And as I've indicated, I thought the other panelists were going to tackle the other parts and so on and so on.
All
and
right.
that's basically is what I wanted to this presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sikhitha. I think you've given us as much as you have prepared for us, and we don't want to take this very lightly because, you know, this subject of economics is often called the inexact science. It's called that for a reason, because it is just so complex and so complicated. And if you attempt to use a ruler or a formula to predict or determine, you always end up with egg in your face. But what is important is to have the tools and the rigor to do analysis and to understand what is being put in front of you. And what you have done was to unpack, particularly on the Lucy, your video keeps disrupting us. Yeah. Yeah. Now, the way I want us to go about this, because as you correctly say, Mr. Sibusiso Nyati specializes in the area of trade economics. So we had asked him to kind of do the same retrospective that you have done, to say, if you look at, you know, the history of trade economics, are you in a position to extrapolate for us what has happened over the centuries, the trade patterns between nations, between continents, and could we explain our current situation as South Africa, as a continent, from the patterns that you would have derived from there? So he had said, no, this is an area that I work in, so I would be able to share some insights with you around it. But unfortunately, he couldn't get through because of the challenges with the network there. But it doesn't mean that we cannot attempt to think through the two other sub areas which I thought we would also zoom in. The first one has to do about the pattern of production over the years, you know, within South Africa, because the whole idea was, let's start at the global level, come to the continental level, and then zoom into our South African reality and try and understand whether we can use history as a subject to make sense of where we are today. Let me see if I can go into a larger screen. Can I go into, just hold on a sec for me? All right, yeah, it looks like I'll win here. Let me stop the share. Okay, why don't I see all of you here now? Dr. Katu, are you still there?
Yeah, I see you.
All right. Okay. Okay. I can't even see myself here. My screen went blank. So I'm trying to have an active screen so that everybody should take interest. There is this fascinating book. Can you see it here? Let me go to my icon.
Okay, you were holding it up.
Is it within view now?
How Europe underdeveloped Africa? Oh, yeah.
The book that you referred to earlier. Walter Rodney, as we know, is probably the most distinguished progressive economic historian who has attempted to explain why Africa is underdeveloped and why South Africa is underdeveloped by tracing patterns of economic history from ancient times up to the present. So what we want to try and do now is to open this discussion to everyone and say, in our view, what is our sense of the productive role that Africans have played in history, in economics? So we are now moving away from theory. We are coming into the productive side of things, which is where we had thought we will start. So I'm not putting you on the spot, but I'm inviting everybody who has logged in here, who might have a view, whether you are coming from the social sciences, whether you are just a keen reader of economics. Share your thoughts. This is a public education platform. This is an adult learning environment. Let's empower one another. So let's talk about the productive role of Africans in, developing or contributing to world economics. Can we start there and maybe hear what you and the other participants have to say? If you need to talk, please try and raise your hand if you can by using Zoom. If not, just unmute yourself, make your comment, ask your question, and then we will all now have a grounding amongst ourselves and try and unpack this heavy subject. Okay, anyone that wants to have a first bite? Let's talk just about the productive side of things. How have Blacks contributed to global economics? I see a hand here. Let me go to my little screen on the side. I want to close this fellow here. Okay, look, I can't seem to get your hand, but go ahead and is that you, Katu, or yet? All right, go ahead, Katu.
Well, basically, I mean, without necessarily being exhaustive, I just wanted to make an observation.
Yes.
Particularly with regards to trade.
Okay.
That to a very large extent, for a lack of a better word, the trading patterns that the so-called colonial masters left their colonies with, whether they had attained independence for however long, have generally not changed.
Okay.
So if colonies were where we get raw products and then we are going to provide them with finished products, that hasn't changed that much. And I think for me, it's quite unfortunate when you consider that if you look at least in sub-Saharan Africa or Africa south of the Sahara, the countries that attained their independence the first, Ghana in 1957, more than 60 years, you would have thought somewhere along the way, we would have plodded along the same route, but somewhere along the way, we probably would have come to realize that, look, this is not working for us. What if we do things differently? And for a whole lot of reasons, which I'm sure we can always talk about, and we probably even have an idea why things like that. Unfortunately, not a lot has changed. And what makes it even worse, on the African continent, we don't trade with each other as much as other people trade with each other, whether it is in Europe, in Asia, or in South America, or even South America and North America, the way they trade among each other is far much higher than the way we trade among each other in the African continent. And I think what I wanted to say above all was, we don't seem to have changed a lot of how we have always done trade. And I think to a very large extent, that perhaps talk to our own undoing, and probably that is probably one of the things that along the way, we probably need to start, looking at more thoroughly, not just look at it, but perhaps even want to go a step further and look at how to change things. I think that's what I wanted to contribute first and foremost regarding the trade patterns. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that contribution. I see there's another hand. Okay, no, I think it's your hand again. All right, maybe not in response to the submission you have made, but if you read Walter Rodney, he actually, as a way, as an analytical tool, breaks the continent down into old empires. Your empire of Songhai, the Mapungubwe, all these other empires that were there, the empire of Sudan, and traces how, communities in those areas could become such powerful empires such that countries or areas like Oman used to come to Africa to come and trade. There's the famous king from the Sudan who used to go on a caravan probably almost every 5 or 10 years to go and trade in the Middle East all the way up to India. And that was before the advent of Arabization of North Africa, and also before the advent of colonialism. So when you read ancient economic history, you do get a sense that there was a time when Africa was very productive and contributing to the global economy, so to speak, in modern parlance. But the question we must ask ourselves, where have these trade patterns become so unbalanced that, Oman or countries from further afield, whether from India and elsewhere, come to Africa to come and sell us what they have, and then we buy what they are offering, and in turn they buy what we are offering. The current global economy now is a so-called pit-to-pot policy, particularly if you look at the developing world, whether it's Africa, China has changed that pattern a bit. But what we are doing here is an extractive economy. We mine gold, we mine raw materials, and all we do is send them to Europe. So there isn't a balanced trading pattern. But it was never the case in ancient history when you read books by economic historians such as Walter Rodney. And perhaps at this point as well, I must cite a very important book, which, as you say, most of these books are not prescribed, we are not exposed to. The book by Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery. I don't know how many of us here are exposed to it. Very important book. If ever you had an interest in the economic history of the world, not just of Africa, and the place of Africans in it, please, I enjoin you to read Eric Williams to understand how, for instance, the West Indies, which is the place where the first Africans actually were taken to work as slaves on the sugar cane fields there, actually contributed to the first industrial economy of Europe. We take it for granted that UK as we know it today has always been historically a rich country. It wasn't. These things happen as a pattern of economic history. UK probably in the 19th century or 18th century only started to ascend global economic power. And that was largely on the back of the productive contributions of Africans, even if it was enforced productive participation, because it was through slavery. It wasn't through fair trade. It wasn't through willing trade. But Africans were forced from the continent, and we know labor is a very important factor of production. They were forced to go and work there in the West Indies, and with the product of their labor, the British then could export to other parts of the world, earn income through the sale of sugar. And that's where the British now started to manufacture machines. They started to establish banks. And that's why London today has become a big trading pattern. So that is just by way of me introducing the subject on production and the contribution that Africans have made in history on the economy. Well, let me take other hands or contributors if they want to come in. Let's talk about production. And then from there, we will talk about what we had glibly called management. But in fact, on second thought, I thought we should have called it organization. How have we organized ourselves through history as Africans in order to withstand the ravages of the economy? As we know, the economy goes through ebbs and flows. But how did our forebears manage to withstand that up to the time where we could also now say, well, fine, we are now participating in a global economy. Any takers, anyone that wants to make a contribution or that wants to share with us? I'm opening it to all our participants. Okay, it's an open session. Nobody wants to add. All right, let's talk about how we have understood or the place of Walter Rodney on the subject of economic history. I know many of you have read Walter Rodney, comrades. Anyone who wants to share? Okay, Dr. Sikhitha, can I invite you to comment on the issue of slavery and its contribution to the global economy up to the first industrial revolution, or the industrial revolution as they used to call it? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, and indeed you are. Well, I can probably perhaps maybe contribute my 2 cents worth.
Yeah.
I guess it probably goes without saying
Yes.
that maybe what constitutes the so-called developed economies that you have today was very much on the back of either slavery or unfair, I wouldn't say unfair trade, perhaps unfair terms of exchange.
Okay.
Over time between maybe the countries that ended up being the so-called colonial masters of other maybe African, South American, Asian countries than otherwise would have been the case. I think you probably touched upon it, you know, when you indicated England was not always a very a rich country. But I think it's important to always acknowledge or realize it was not always like that. If you look at the over time, I think it was only probably from the period, I think in the late 1400s, the Spanish Inquisition,
Yes.
when this relationship between what we now call the developed world and the so-called developing world kind of like changed. Before then, you know, you had a situation where basically you couldn't even tell the difference, the difference between somebody who would have been from Europe and somebody who would have been from Africa. They were all almost equals, exchanging ambassadors and what have you.
Yeah.
And for a lot of reasons, the economic forces of that time, responding to whatever would have been an issue, I'm sure we can talk about it some other time. But the period from the late 1400s, which coincided with the Spanish Inquisition, you know, the movement from Europe to the Americas and what have you, gave rise to a very large extent to the skewed relationship that you see today that perhaps even talks to inequality, skewed trade, what have you, and what have you, and what have you. For example, history will tell you that, initially, those who were supposed to be enslaved and to work on the sugarcane fields, for a lack of a better word, were South Americans. And somehow somebody, a very prominent bishop, without necessarily mentioning the denomination, was of the view that these guys were not hardy enough, to be able to make it in the fields. Let's go for Africans, who for the longest of times were equals. If you look back at the relationship between the Portuguese and the African communities that they made contact with first, whether it was in present day Nigeria, present day Angola, or what have you, Bishop Las Calas. And then he decided, no, these guys are not hardy enough to do the kind of work that we want them to do. Let's turn our focus to Africa. And then indeed, you ended up with a situation where somebody who thought, no, it was not about what ended up happening. All I thought was these ones were more suitable for this kind of work than the guys we found in South America. And then it opened up all sorts of things that unfortunately, perhaps today, leaves us with the situation that we have. Indeed, I'll always say it is very interesting when you look at not only England, but if you look at a country like Portugal,
yes,
and look at how small it is, and you look at the country like Angola that they colonized for how many years? 300-400 years? And even Mozambique.
yeah.
How many times Angola is bigger than Portugal? How many times Mozambique is bigger than Portugal? And but when you look at the root cause of that skewed relationship, it was not always like that. It was very different from that, and indeed, I think to a certain extent, I think that was probably the historical bit that I wanted to contribute, and I'm sure you can use that to even explain the relationship between the UK and its former colonies, if one can put it like that. And you could probably say the same about Germany, and so on and so on and so on. But I think the point I wanted to make was it was not always like that.
Okay. All right. No, thanks. I think you have actually hit the nail on the head and actually become more substantive as I had anticipated, because the Industrial Revolution is an important marker of time. That's where you start seeing this heightened or aggressive implementation of racism, because as we often say, capitalism is always connected with racism, because that's where we see that particularly your British colonizers of the West Indies and the Europeans now start to target us as Africans, as you say, perhaps because they have this assumption that we were stronger, but it was our skin color that they used, to target us to go and work in those fields in the West Indies. But then we move from the West Indies into America, and that's the connection between politics and the economy. In America, of course, there were parts of America that were under Portuguese and maybe the Netherlands and all that. But ultimately, the British become very dominant there. And then they realize, okay, but sugar now is not as lucrative. Cotton can actually bring us a lot of money because everybody wants to now wear clothes. They want cotton also for production. And also what they discover is that now we have more territory that we can exploit, but we will need more labor. And thus a heightened enslavement of Africans happens towards North America, or America as we know it today. And it is true that because if you exploit the labor of people, ultimately you extract profit out of their labor, and you concentrate what we call capital. And once you have a concentration of capital, you now start feeling that, well, you know what, I become a dominant political force. So there's always this connection between economics and political power. So what do these so-called explorers or settlers in America do? They now realize that, well, you know, and these were just peasant people who were going to work in America and try and make a living, because in Europe, they were the underclasses. We must not forget that. But then once they settle in the West Indies and in America, and we will come to Africa later on, they start to amass wealth and they start to aspire to live like your landed gentry in Europe. So in places like Manchester, London, Liverpool, that's where they start to now say, well, you know, we have the money, so let's build these mansions and what have you. And then they start factories with the capital that they have acquired as a result of the contributions of Africans in those slave farms in America and the West Indies. So that history, that global history of the world becomes very important about how we are so central as Africans because of our labor. We will then come to land later, because once they realize that, well, we can't now exploit the labor of Africans through slavery anymore, then they go to the Berlin Conference, where they decide an important factor of labor, according to Adam Smith, our economic intellectual, is land. Now, not all of us can have access to acres and acres of land, but there is the African continent. And today I saw a very interesting post by a mutual friend of mine. I'll check his or her name now, Khatija Khan, I think, who said, well, it's surprising. And I always assumed that, you know, the Asian continent was much larger than Africa. But the statistics show that the largest mass of land is actually here in Africa. Yet when you look at the map, you'd actually think that Africa is one of the smaller areas, which motivates the Europeans and the new you know, capitalist classes in Europe to say, well, we need to now move into Africa. Let's no longer take slaves there. Let's move into Africa, suppress them where they are, dispossess them of their land, force them to work our lands where they are. And that's where they start, you know, earning further capital and ipso facto, getting more power economically, and then continuing to oppress us. Now, all of this information is in Walter Rodney's book, and I'm trying with this comment I'm making to underscore why not just economics or macroeconomics or pure economics is important, but why economic history also becomes very crucial if we want to undo the inequities, the unbalanced trading patterns that are in existence today. Okay, let me open it for other participants. If there's anybody that feels motivated enough now to make a comment and share their ideas with us on the subject we are discussing. I think we are now left with about almost 12 to 18 minutes to wrap it all up. But let's make it more interesting with contributions around the subject. I know that oftentimes the economics has been demystified, and most of the progressive economics say, no, it's because people have been misinformed that economics is all about statistics, it's all about mathematics. But in essence, this subject of economics, where it started, it was part of the social sciences. But progressively, it has been hived off from the social sciences, such that when people talk economics, a lot of us feel that, no, we can't make a contribution. But you know, maybe there are social scientists here who can give us their own paradigmatic views about the issue under discussion. Anyone? Or should we move on?
Can I just have a question?
Well, yes, Becky. Madolo.
Yeah, I was just reading a book, Pantheon, is it Pan-African Pantheon? And part of what I learned that the Africa or colonized places were designed to create wealth to colonizers, and effectively Africa is not changed that kind of pattern. So we are still, I mean, railways were created to take raw materials to to those countries. So that has not changed. And part of the problem with inter-Africa trade is that I don't think we've moved away from mental colonization or mental oppression. So in a sense,
Okay. Comrades, can we behave ourselves? Please mute yourselves. There's a speaker on the podium, Kangelweni. I don't want to call you with your names, but you are forcing me to.
Yeah.
All right.
So in a sense, we still find it difficult to, because we have not dealt with mental colonization or mental slavery.
Yes.
In the African continents, to still find it difficult to see ourselves as people that we can trade each other. So in a sense, if you go to any country in Africa that produces anything, the first place they think about is the first world, not the other African country.
Okay.
So for example, goods from South Africa will be accepted because there's a white person involved. And I think personally, until we deal with mental colonization, we can have as many educated people as possible to not work. I mean, just to make an example, I attended a conference which had the best economists and finance people from the continent.
Yeah.
I still felt like I was in, when I attended the conference, I felt that that conference could have been held in London or in New York, because
I hope you don't feel like that tonight.
No.
Okay, but go ahead.
Discussion were not related to anything that, I mean, I was excited because I thought we'd deal with solutions for the African continent, but there was nothing discussing theories of Europe. So for me, I think that's where the issue is. And just one comment before I end, in terms of the South African context, is that, I mean, since 1994, white wealth has exponentially grown, but blacks have become much more poor.
Okay.
And I don't think, and part of my battles is that we are kind of not dealing with black poverty in South Africa and see how we can change it. I mean, do you have thoughts about that? Because I mean, statistically is that white people, changes in South Africa has helped white people quite a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they should continue to vote for the ANC if they want to remain rich. So, but I find that we
I hope
not
it's not sarcasm,
solutions.
but we get the point. Yeah.
I feel the sense that we're not discussing how to deal with black poverty and the fact that we've got lack of access to anything. You know.
Okay.
Basically, that's. I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay. Anyone else that wants to comment, please just open your mic and share your ideas with us. But thank you very much for that comment, Bekin Kosimadolo. That's precisely the kind of conversation we want this Black History Month, platforms to have. And yeah, that's a very pointed comment. Anyone that wants to comment?
Okay.
Okay. Now, before you come in, I saw your hand up, but I just want to see if we can let the other participants to make a contribution. So, Sis Nondobeko, please do.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity, Comrade Kibadisa.
Thank you.
I think when Katu mentioned earlier on about economic dominance being the main, the European or imperialists still dominating our economies is still a very critical thing for us to address, because if we cannot overcome that, find ways to overcome that dominance, then there's not much hope for us as Africans on our continent to be able to look constructively at issues of production and organizing around it.
Yeah.
It's a crippling factor for us, and I think they've really worked and strategized on developing the economic controls they have over Africa for many centuries now, and we're aware of this. You know, the issues you're discussing now, which are historical, are well known to us. And it's about us trying to break free of that dominance. How do we go about that? I mean, the last speaker just mentioned the issue of dealing with our mental, the need to address our mental consciousness.
Yes.
And but it also applies to empowering people in relation to the skills they already have, even as laborers and as slaves. We have specific skills which, if we tapped into them, we could actually become empowered and be able to develop slowly but surely our own economies within our own areas, until such time you can unite people around what they are doing. I was recalling when I studied environmental sciences, and I specialized on Zimbabwe in terms of the land distribution policy that they introduced in their country. And they attempted to empower their people through land tenure, through training programs, etc., and even through their education system, where they ensured that their education system was based on skills development as a major priority. These are things that we need to find a way of addressing in our communities, because we know that the current dispensation in our country is not going to deliver. It just isn't. No matter how much you keep pressing on those buttons, you know that they're part of the dominant economic structure of the world. So we really need to think of how we are going to deal with those disadvantages we're faced with. And it really does need us to talk strategically about how we address them.
Okay, thank you. I think I should thank you and Begin Kosi for underlining that. But that especially if we are going to find a way of undoing these economic strictures that suppress our development, it's the mental paradigm shift that is required. Now, and part of the reason why we are having this discussion is, if the brightest of our kids who hit your 190% at matric continue to be channeled into the same, kind of, call them, development channels when it comes to theory, when it comes to knowledge acquisition, they are going to come up there out of that system also believing that, well, yeah, an economic being or a rational being behaves in this way. And if they do that, then they are going to write policies, programs, implement projects that accord with that kind of worldview. And that's why a discussion like this then says, how did countries like China extricate themselves out of these dominant global patterns? How does a country like India, which is now starting to breathe above the water, how did it get to where it is, such that now they're starting to control their own manufacturing sector? They're starting to become dominant. Today, when we speak, it's as if, this is a normal thing. 20 years ago, we wouldn't be saying, let's get our vaccines from India. But a politically conscious administration at some point did have to take a decision to say, we are going to grow the Indian pharmacological sector. Now, do we have that kind of political will in this country? But before political will, it takes some consciousness for you to be able to say, economic policy makers, I want a law that says this. Economic analysts, I want you to analyze for me whether we are achieving these goals that we want. But let me not to talk a lot. I'm not on the forum here. Anyone that wants to make a comment before I go back to Dr. Sikhitha to try and give us a wrap of the interactions this evening? Please feel free to make your contribution. These are this we must demystify economics by bringing it closer to the people of our reality. So I'm trying to encourage as many of us to participate here. Anyone that wants to have a take? Okay, if not, let me give over to you, Dr. Sikhitha. Maybe just respond to what Begin Kosi said and Menon Tobacco, and maybe give us your views projecting into the future about the solutions that we should consider as Tanzanians, as Africans, as Black people throughout the world, so that we can claim our pound of flesh, as it were, in this global economic system.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps the thoughts may be a bit disjointed, but
Okay.
maybe you'll get my drift. And I think I also want to appreciate the two interventions that we received.
Mm.
I think it's important basically to ask ourselves, where is our station in life at this current point in time?
Mm-hmm.
I think it goes without any argument that what we call the South African economy at the moment, we are all trying to prop up an economic system that never talked to the majority of South Africans, which was exclusionary, has always been exclusionary, and we are all, in my opinion, trying to do our best to make it as exclusionary, perhaps even more so than what it has been. And I think it is important for us to recognize that and start to ask ourselves, how do we start to practically change this situation? Otherwise, when all is said and done, whatever, in my opinion, it is that we think constitutes the South African economy, we are all just trying to fight to become part and parcel of the very small group that has always excluded the majority. And indeed, the previous speaker, the first speaker, who indicated certain South Africans have become even more well off than was the case before even 1994. Indeed, I think you are going to get an outcome like that if you realize that we have an economy that has always been exclusionary, and to the best of our ability, we are trying to maintain that exclusivity, if one can put it like that. But indeed, if you were to ask yourself even further, who says things have to be done the same way they've always been done? If you go back to a certain extent, 1913, the passage of the Natives Land Act. Initially, 7.5% of the land is set aside for blacks. Over time, in 1935, is amended so that we ended up with the 13%. When you look at this privately owned land that we have in South Africa, and you go to one of the slides that was showing the parcels of land that were available, we are basically talking about the parcels of land as per what the Surveyor General has in his or a register. That's what we are talking about. We are not talking about the parcel of land where the majority of the people live. And indeed, if you are in that part of South Africa, and let's say you are a civil servant, for example, you have a secure job up until you retire, and you wanted to go to a financial institutions to get loan finance, a bond to build your house. First, you are going to be told you don't have a title deed. As if a title deed must fall from the sky. And therefore, we cannot fund you. But indeed, I just wanted to use this as an example. There was a point in time, and that model is still very much in existence today, where people found a way to bypass these traditional financial institutions and still made it possible for civil servants who, for all intents and purposes, will probably be employed for more than 20 years that it takes for you to service a bond, and you end up having formal structures. One of the slides that we were not able to go through, I wanted to indicate that if you look at your so-called rural provinces, Mpumalanga, the Northwest, Limpopo, and what have you, you have individuals there who have formal structures that are not funded or financed by the banks, maybe because they don't have title deeds, but you have arrangements which basically bypass this impediment. There is nobody who can convince all of us over here. If you cannot fund other South Africans the way you fund other South Africans when it comes to their residencies, and you say it is because they don't have a bond or they don't have a title deed. Where is that title deed supposed to come from? I remember sharing an experience with Mohamedi. Every year, as civil servants, we are supposed to do our financial declarations. And I was always, honestly, at the pain of perjury, always declaring, I've got a property in the rural area. And I have a property where I stay in Pretoria. And then one day, the department that checks those things, they come back and say, we could only find one property in Pretoria. This other one that you have in the rural area, we could not find. Please explain that. I sent them a stinker to say, so when I go to the rural area and I'm going to my house, do you think I live on a tree or I live under a rock? And indeed, why are you asking this to me after 1994? Am I the one who's supposed to explain why I don't have a title deed for the piece of land where I have my house in the rural area and what cheek? They never responded to that. And from that day onwards, I never declare any property that I have in the rural area. And indeed, when you do a lifestyle check, for argument's sake, if I have a triple-storied house that is as a result of a dubious proceeds, who are you going to associate that to? Because in South Africa, unless you live in previously formal South Africa, where either the townships were, they were proclaimed and so on and so on, the rest of us who don't live there basically don't live in a formal South Africa. And you ask yourself, but this is happening after 1994. I think I'm just trying to echo the points that were raised by the two speakers, that let us look at our station in life at this point in time and then ask ourselves, if we want to move away from this economy that is still even more exclusive than what it was before 1994, clearly we're just all fighting for crumbs. And indeed, whether the economy grows at 3%, 3% of 1 million people is very different from 3% of 60 million people if everybody else was participating. Not all of us are participating. And I think these are some of the things that, by way of a solution, we need to start looking into. Because in the alternative, for a lack of a better word, we're basically just chasing our tails, and we're making worse what was already a difficult situation. So when I use that example of the Carnegie Commission, there was a time in the history of this country where a problem was identified. And that problem was comprehensively dealt with, and within a generation. Yes, through exclusionary policies and what have you, that problem was entirely addressed, if one can put it like that. One last example I wanted to just pose over here. One of the recommendations of that Carnegie Commission, when it comes to where people live, we still have it today. Drive through a typical black township. You'll be lucky if you are able to pass another car on the street. But go to a typical white suburb. White streets, big stands, and the other thing that you are going to find, which you won't find in a typical black township, is the amount of open spaces that you have in a typical white suburb. That was part and parcel of the recommendations of the Carnegie Commission, because they realized when you sit down in a park, you are listening to the water flowing and the birds singing, you are able perhaps even to address some of the challenges that you have that otherwise you will not have been able to. You don't even need to take an antidepressant. But go to a typical black township. If you find an open space or even a park, you will be very lucky. This is not how we take things forward when we don't take stock of where we are. What are the things that we want to address or that we want to do away with? And what are the things that we want to take forward? Some of these things, in my opinion, are just practical things. They've been done before. We know the results. But for some reasons, we think all of us seem to be fighting to be part and parcel of this exclusive economy, shut everybody else out, and then it is business as usual. It probably would have worked back in the day when there were 20 million South Africans. When you have got 70 million South Africans, that model is not going to work, and we probably need to find a way of looking at things in a manner that does not talk to only a very small component of the economy, because that is what is currently happening, in my opinion, but find a way to talk to the overall economy, because indeed, if you look at it from macroeconomic point of view, we are all better off when all of us are participating as opposed to when only a few of us are participating. That is, among other things, part and parcel of what I wanted to contribute when you say by way of a solution. Some of these things were challenged before, they were tackled, and I want to think, I don't see any reason why we cannot have a concerted effort to look at the problem of inequality and the problem of poverty in this country, given what, in my opinion, has happened in the past, and given what is still possible if we wanted to take things from one point to another. Thank you very much.
Okay, no, thank you. I take it those were your closing remarks, Dr. Sikhitha. I really
Yes, they
want,
were.
yes, I really want to express the, appreciation of our organization, AZAPO. The president is set through your presentation. It just goes to show how seriously he takes you, but he takes these Black History Month webinars. And he sat through here for 2 hours, and we just want to also express appreciation to you, Comrade President Strike Tukwane, for making time aside to listen to what our guest had to present. But in the same vein, also to thank the participants. Some of you also have sat through this with us for 2 hours, listening to Dr. Sikhitha, the interventions by other participants. And the whole point about this is to achieve precisely what Bekin Kosi and Osman Dobeko raised about how do we change this unfortunate reality, a reality that is not so by default, but that is by design. Because Dr. Sikhitha has presented to us and told us that all of these things that we see today, the Cape to Cairo rail that we are still using, the trading patterns that are in existence today, they are all set up to reinforce the old slave trading patterns, the old colonial slaving patterns, the neo-colonial trading patterns. And if we are going to, design or think out solutions to, address the problems that we have to also, bring in our own original thinking, our own innate thinking as Africans, as people who are oppressed, as people who are exploited, to say we can end this over-exploitation of our people by generating social policies, by generating labor policies, by generating agrarian policies, like Dr. Sikhitha was saying when introducing the subject to us with the Carnegie Commission. But let's keep on thinking as Africans. God, as Steve Biko said, is not in the habit of, stepping down from the heavens to address our problems on earth. We have to address those problems. Our young comrades who are studying these subjects, part of the reason why we are having these discussions is to also share with you what we went through and the reservations we had about what we went through. And it is to say to you, look, if I've got it correctly. So ask people like Dr. Sikhitha who are in this field of economics to say, how can I make my studies more meaningful to myself and to my people, so that we address this problem. Thank you very much. We will be continuing with these Black History Month seminars. I think our next topic on Wednesday, if all goes well, because we rely on the support of our speakers and panelists to make themselves available. Our next topic will probably on the history of science and the contributions of Black people and Black inventors, a very interesting subject, because we also want to demystify this idea that all the machines, all the technologies that we see in the world today were invented by white people or those who have economic and political dominion upon us. But that there were Black people in history that also designed these things. Thank you very much. As we sign out, have a good evening and a good